Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your tuning in. Uh, there's been so much going on. You watch the news and you certainly see so much that's happening in the world in our nation and world even. In response to the murder of George Floyd, there has been so much that has happened. It's made me examine again my own feelings. You see, I was born in Plaquemines Parish, which is only about 15 miles from New Orleans. 20 miles if you go down river, because the river curves. But certainly right there. And there were some things that Plaquemines Parish was noted for. We had a lot of oil, so there was a lot of money, and most of our government officials managed to get their hands on that. And in the political boss that ruled our parish, which is what we call counties down there, but he was generous enough that most people got their share. Roads were paved, scholarships were given to college to both black and white children, and all kinds of things that they did to sort of, I suppose, keep us all happy is the way I look at it now, but who knew back then? But of course, one thing that our political boss, Judge Leander H. Perez, was he was a famous segregationist / read the word racist. And that is absolutely true. He actually was one of the big shaker and movers behind the campaign of George Wallace and was very proud of that. He was extremely bigoted. And of course, I was born in 1955. So the whole school integration movement happened when I was a child. And I remember Judge Perez so vividly. He was at that time, I was raised Roman Catholic and he was a Catholic and he belonged to our church. Well, until there was a Catholic school in Plaquemines Parish which was going to allow black children to attend along with the white children. He opposed it when he couldn't stop it. He and some other people, it was proven, though not in a court of law, that they firebombed the church. And for that, the Catholic Church excommunicated him. Now, what he used to do was he'd still come to church. He was allowed to be present in church. He was just excommunicated from receiving the sacraments. And he used to sit in the back of church, and chew on a stub of a cigar, and twirl his Panama hat in his hands. And then by the way, he had a bodyguard. Bodyguard's name was Dutch. Dutch used to stand outside the doors because he wore a gun. Of course, didn't bring guns into church back then. And then the judge would run out, would be sure and leave at the end of the service. He'd leave and got outside before the priest did. And then he'd form his own receiving line where he'd shake hands and talk to people. I vividly remember that my brother was going to be confirmed in the Roman Catholic Church at that time. When you were about 12 years old, you were confirmed. And the thing was, the bishop had to come and do the confirmation service himself. So we were a church that operated 2 smaller mission churches. And the mission churches were black. And the children who were ready for confirmation would be brought to our church, and all of them, the children, both black and white, would be confirmed together by the bishop with the bishop's visit. Well, my brother went to confirmation practice on Saturday before the service before the service, and unfortunately, the judge showed up to have a conversation with the priest. Father Frank was his name back then. Father Frank Gasimovich. And he told Father Frank, you're not going to, my brother was present and told me this, you're not going to allow these I'm not going to permit you to have these black children confirmed with these white children. And he said, well, you're in no position to stop me. And I don't know where it went from there. My brother didn't hear the whole conversation inside the church, but apparently Father Frank said something, and Dutch, the bodyguard, got mad and punched Father Frank right in the eye, right there in the midst of church. Well, Father Frank had a big old black eye. I do remember that. He actually was interviewed on the news talking about it. As it turned out, my brother was confirmed on schedule, along with the African American children. However, it didn't take place at our church in Belle Chase. It took place at the cathedral in New Orleans, the St. Louis Cathedral, because of the uproar. So you can imagine the environment I grew up in. Was I prejudiced as a child? And I have to say I was. But where did I learn that prejudice? Well, I didn't learn it from my parents. My parents always treated African Americans with respect, and I was required to respect them too. Probably the only concession to that was given was that we always had a housekeeper when I was young who was African American. And you've heard me talk about her often, and her name was Nancy. Now I look at it now and I realize that was a little subtle thing. You see, the parents of the neighbor children, the neighbors who I played with, their parents were always Miss Hilda, or Miss Mildred, or Miss Piku, or Miss Ballet. I called them Miss, whether I used their first name or their last name. But Mom and Dad didn't require that with Nancy, and neither did Nancy ask for that. I never thought about it, really, until lately. Here now, so many years later. But I realized it was a subtle statement, a subtle reflection of the culture I lived in. A culture that taught me racism. No, my parents didn't teach it to me. But the culture I lived in, I felt the people I knew, the fellow students I knew, they taught me. I remember as a child getting laughed at by my friends by my older friends, because I was too young to read and I couldn't tell the difference between the white water fountain and the black water fountain, the colored water fountain. And I drank from the wrong water fountain. Another time, probably before I could read, because I remember I couldn't. I, for some reason, was going to the bathroom by myself in a grocery store. And I managed to go to the colored bathroom. And I remember a very kind woman who said, "Child, you look like you're lost. Let me help you find your parents." Oh, I learned racism. I can remember being young enough. It was probably back when the whole debate about segregation was happening, that my parents were sitting in the front seat of the car. And I was small enough that I had to kind of stand on my toes as I held to the back of the front seat and talked to them. And I jumped into their conversation. They were discussing the integration of our schools, which was bitterly opposed by our local political boss, I found out later. But I can actually remember saying, "I don't know why they're not happy with separate but equal." Now, why did a 5-year-old child say that? 6-year-old child, however old I was. Why did I say that? Because I'd heard it. And that's exactly what my mother turned around and told me. "Kathy, you're just repeating what you heard, but you really don't know what's going on." And I didn't. But still, even though I knew nothing, of bigotry and racism at home. Not in any major way. As I said, the only thing I can think of now is that my mom and dad didn't insist that I call Nancy Miss Nancy the way they would with any other adult I came into daily contact with. But I was required to respect her and to obey her. But that was easy because, you see, I loved her, and she loved us. And the things she did for us that went above and beyond, I've talked about many times. She really did wonderful things for us. No, I didn't learn racism at home. I didn't learn it from the African American people that I came in contact with when I was young. I didn't learn it from them. Because, to be quite honest with you, I can't remember an unkind interaction with anyone who is African American in my very prejudiced and racist world that I grew up in. Except I don't remember any. No. I learned it from the people around me. I learned it from the kids in school. I learned it from the adults, the other adults that I overheard talking, using racial slurs and just referring to them, to people of color, as if they were second class. And I absorbed it like a sponge, just like children absorb everything that's around them. Now, that's where I learned it. That's where I learned it. But fortunately, I also learned to love. The things that Nancy did for us when we were young were wonderful. She always went the extra mile. She considered us part of her family. Although even she, I suppose, she sort of bought into some of the culture. She couldn't probably help but absorb it. She called us her white folks, which of course was a term that African Americans, enslaved Afro Americans, would use about their owners. It dated back that far. There again, I was in a world I didn't really think about it. I knew that when Nancy used it, she used it with love. And that's all I thought about. But yet there were times, even with Nancy, that I am ashamed that I didn't react with the kind of love that the prejudice and the racism that had seeped into my being, absorbed from so many different areas, made me hold back. A wonderful picture, my sister, of Nancy and Betsy and I. And I'm probably about 11 years old. I'm in my school uniform, navy blue and white shirts and navy blue slacks and black and white saddle Oxford shoes. That was what we wore. And my sister and I, both dressed the same, are standing there, and Nancy's got her arms around us. And my little sister, Betsy was 8, she was probably about 8, and I look about 10 or 11. And Betsy's beaming. But I remember at the moment the picture snapped and Nancy had her arm around me, holding me, my face, when I look at it, it caught that moment when I felt uncomfortable. Not that Nancy would hug me, because goodness knows she hugged me all the time, but that it would be recorded in a picture. You see, I look at that picture now, and even though it's blurred, I know that my face is not beaming with joy the way Betsy's is. No, my face has a moment of self-consciousness, because here I am getting a picture taken that will show an African American person hugging me, and I look uncomfortable. I can remember every year Nancy used to take us to Pontchartrain Beach, which is a local amusement park. Oh, it was wonderful. Well, Betsy and I were in line for a ride, and Nancy came over to talk to us, and then she went back and sat down. And when she did, the children who were standing right in front of us turned to us and said, "Is that your mother?" And I was like, "My mother?" Nancy was a very dark-skinned African American, and I thought, how can you think she'd be my mother? But no mother could have loved me more than Nancy did. And I loved her almost as much as I loved my own mother. But yet that culture, that prejudice, that racism had seeped into my consciousness, even at that young age, probably 8 or 9. No, I wasn't taught it by my parents. And I certainly didn't learn prejudice and racism from any African American I came in contact with. I learned it from my culture. Fortunately, as I grew, I began to see the real wrongness of it. And by the time I was in my early teens, and I became aware of all the things that Martin Luther King was doing, I was a great admirer. And I was shocked and cried as bitterly when he was assassinated as I did for President Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy. But even then, I realized I realize now that as socially minded and as aware of the rights of African Americans and civil rights as I thought I was at the time, there was a part of me that still retained racist positions and views within my core almost. I remember being young, and by the time I went to high school, our school was integrated. We had a large number of African Americans who ranged in some who had very dark skinned, like Nancy. Some had very light skin. As a matter of fact, I remember Leontine Glenn. She was so fair. She was very light skinned. But she even had red hair, natural red hair, because the hair on her arm was even red. And yet she was African American. And I was aware of that distinction. And I remember through working on projects getting close to an African American, light-skinned African American boy, nearly my own age. And kind of liking him, but stopping myself from liking him too much. Because after all, he was black. And I was white, and that didn't happen. I heard through the grapevine that he had a crush on me. And I realized if I let myself, I'd have a crush on him. But no, I walked away from that. Because after all, I was white, and he was black. And though I wouldn't have mind dated him, it was the idea of how people would react. You see, interracial couples were very rare in New Orleans. I never saw very many interracial couples, even as an adult. And remember, I didn't leave Louisiana until I was 54 years old. And you rarely saw them. That's because the culture made life very difficult for them then. It's one of the things I noticed when I came up here. Look at all these interracial couples. I've never seen so many. I realize now that even mature, even already a Methodist minister, even angry and struggling with my Louisiana congregations for their ingrained prejudice and their racism, and feeling so strongly about it, and struggling with it as I tried to minister to otherwise good people who couldn't see the wrongness in their thoughts. Yet I still found it odd that I would see interracial couples. I should have been glad. Not slightly uncomfortable. There was a little bit of discomfort, and I realize now that's because I still have work to do to weed out the prejudice that I have within inside of me. There's lots of people out there protesting, and I'm so glad to see people of all colors protesting, that shouting in one voice that Black Lives Matter, affirming that all people are created equal, and so we should. It's true that I absorbed it as a child. But you know, Paul says, when I was a child, I thought like a child. I spoke like a child. But now that I'm an adult, I need to put away childish ways. So many of us are not in a position to protest in the streets. The COVID, so many other things stand in the way. The quarantine. But there is one place where we can root out racism, and that's within ourselves. I know I've given it a lot of thought, and I know that I still have work to do. We can do that. We can fight racism within ourselves. Look at ourselves honestly. And if we find it, ask God for forgiveness and for healing. We can also pray and support all those who are working peacefully to change our system. A system whose racist bias infused so many different levels that we're often not even aware of it, just as I wasn't aware of it when I was a child. I hope our country lets this be a time of change. I hope this is the last time we have to fight for the equality of Black people in our nation. I hope it's a time that it happens for the whole world. And along with the awareness of the fact that all people are created in God's image and likeness, no matter who they are, no matter how they appear on the outside, no matter what beliefs they hold, no matter what lifestyle they choose, that they are all created in the image and likeness of God. We need to look beyond. May our whole world, it is my fervent prayer, and I hope you will join me in this, because that is something you can do from home. That peoples everywhere would learn to recognize the image of God in one another and respect that and honor that as they would honor themselves. it's not a new idea on my part. I think it's what Jesus meant when he said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. I'm proud of all the things I see the people at the Hermitage doing. I'm proud of all the diversity we have in our facility, in our home, in our community. I'm proud of so many of the residents who have worked in different ways in their life to make equality and justice a reality. And I'm proud of all who still labor in their hearts to help the world by starting one person at a time, to see people as created equal the way we truly are. God bless you. Until next time.